Today we're going to read a nonfiction article entitled Dunder and Blixem, Who Really Wrote the Night Before Christmas. And before we read the article for the first time, we're going to do a little bit of pre-reading using a strategy called THIEVES. THIEVES is a reading strategy that helps you understand reading informational text. And basically, THIEVES is simply an acronym or a mnemonic device that helps you remember to use the title, the headings, the introduction, the first sentences of each section, visuals and vocabulary, the end of the text, and summarize your thinking. So let's go through the THIEVES strategy just for a moment before we start reading. The title. Whenever you're pre-reading or whenever you're getting ready to read a nonfiction article, you should always look at the title and try to make a prediction about what you think the author is writing about, what you think the article is going to be about. Perhaps maybe you could try to predict what the main or what the central idea or the central message is. Also, keep in mind what you already know about the topic. In this instance, we've already read. We read yesterday. We've already read the Night Before Christmas poem, which this article relates to, obviously, and so we have a little bit of background information. Then you use the headings in the article. If there are subheadings, you want to pay special attention to them because they introduce smaller topics or smaller sections of the main idea. Then if you read the subheadings, you can get a general idea of what each section is going to be about. Then you check for an introduction. A lot of times with a nonfiction article, you'll have some type of introduction, maybe a sentence or two or maybe a paragraph that will kind of introduce you to the main idea of the article. Then you read every first sentence, and what this does, it helps you get a general idea of what the entire article is about by reading the topic sentence of each section. Also, you're going to look for visuals and vocabulary. Are there pictures? Are there graphs? Are there charts? Pay special attention to those before you even read the article. So when you get to that point as you're reading, you'll already be familiar with the graphic. Also, for vocabulary, you should always look for boldface words, words that have the definition in parentheses, or words that give you a context clue as to their meaning. Then you pay attention to the end of the text. Are there questions at the end? Is there a closing or summary paragraph or sentence? Then, once you're finished with that, you can summarize your own thinking, make a prediction about what you think the whole article is going to be about, and you can start reading. So, now I'm ready to start on my nonfiction article, Dunder and Blixem, Who Really Wrote the Night Before Christmas? And going back to my THIEVES strategy, I'm going to start with the title. The title is Dunder and Blixem, Who Really Wrote the Night Before Christmas? Now, this title tells me two things. First of all, it tells me that there is some question about who wrote the poem. Also, it makes me wonder if these two words here, Dunder and Blixem, might be alternate names for maybe Donner and Blitzen. So I'm thinking that this article may actually be an argument, possibly, about who wrote this poem. The next thing I do, using the THIEVES model, is to look at the headings. So, let's go back to the article and do that. Well, I don't see any headings yet. But as we go down, we see here, right jolly old elf. That's our first subheading. And the subheading there reminds me of actually one of the lines from the poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas. And I'm thinking maybe this section is about St. Nicholas. I should probably change the color. Okay. So that's my prediction for that section. Now as I go along in the article, I see this strange subheading, da-da-dum, da-da-dum. And that's pretty interesting. I'm not really sure what that might mean. Sounds like some kind of song. Maybe some kind of rhythm. And as I go on along further, see the next heading. It's called Speaking of Reindeer. So I'm assuming that this heading, or this section, is going to be about reindeer, maybe Santa's reindeer. Okay, that was easy enough. Now the next step on our thieves strategy is the introduction. So let's go back to the article and look at the introduction, which in this case seems to be, "'Twas the night before Christmas when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse." This is actually part of the poem, the very beginning of the poem. Moving along to the next part of our strategy, we read every first sentence, and what we're going to do is look at each section, starting with the first paragraph. "So begins one of the most beloved poems in the world." That's the beginning of the poem that we read. Then in the next section, originally titled An Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas, the poem was first published anonymously in 1823 in a newspaper in Troy, New York. Okay. The next section, the verse is written in anapestic tetrameter, which emphasizes the beat on every third syllable, da-da-dum, da-da-dum. And the final section, now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on, Comet, on, Cupid, on, Dunder and Blixem. So we've read the first sentence of each section, and that should give us an indication of how the article may progress. Moving along to visual and vocabulary, although I did not see any vocabulary words in bold in the whole article, I did find a visual. And the visual is a picture of Santa and the sleigh being pulled by a reindeer. So this is I'm pretty confident at this point that this article is going to be about the poem The Night Before Christmas, which is actually entitled A Visit from St. Nicholas. Now we look at the end of the text. How is the text wrapped up? How is the article ended? Let's go all the way down to the end. And while we don't see any questions at the end of the text, we do have a paragraph that may serve as the closing paragraph. Foster's challenge of Moore's authorship of the Christmas classic will cause debate among literary scholars. Meanwhile, the rest of us can just hang our stockings by the chimney with care and be glad the jolly old poem lives on. So there's somebody named Foster, and he is challenging the authorship, which means to me that there's a debate over who actually wrote it. So, and that goes right back to the title, which asks the question, who really wrote The Night Before Christmas? Now, I'm pretty confident I know what this article is going to be about, so I'm ready now to go ahead and read and make margin notes. And for my margin notes, I'm going to choose a different color, just so I'll know that these are notes that I took while I was reading instead of my pre-reading strategy. Now that we've finished with our pre-reading strategy, we're going to go ahead and read the whole article all the way through one time, just for a general overview, and then we'll come back and go a little bit more in depth with the article. You'll notice as we read that there are words that have now been underlined that weren't underlined before. This is because these were not words that were already indicated as vocabulary words in the article, but they're words that have been identified as words that could be problematic or that you may not know the definition of. And the definitions of those words that have now been underlined are in the margin for you. As we read through the first time, you may want to glance at those definitions. I'm not going to go through the definitions this time, but we will talk about them on the next read. Dunder and Blixem, Who Really Wrote The Night Before Christmas? By Debbie Nevins. 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. So begins one of the most beloved poems in the world. Countless families read it aloud on Christmas Eve. Many people can recite it by heart. Indeed, the poem, commonly called The Night Before Christmas, has a special place in the hearts of millions across the country, and everyone knows that a jolly old gentleman named Clement Clark Moore wrote the verse. Except 'twasn't, says Don Foster, a well-known literary detective. Legend has it that Moore wrote the poem for his family while headed home in a sleigh after buying the Christmas turkey. In his book, Author Unknown, On the Trail of Anonymous, Foster says that Moore, 1779 to 1863, a wealthy biblical scholar and poet, falsely claimed credit for the poem in 1844. Foster analyzes writings of anonymous or questionable authorship, such as poems, books, and ransom notes, in order to identify the author. No two individuals write exactly the same way, using words in the same combinations, or with the same patterns of spelling and punctuation, Foster says. Indeed, writing style is as unique as fingerprints or DNA, he argues. The real author, Foster claims, was the little-known Dutch-American poet named Major Henry Livingston, Jr., 1748 to 1828, an officer in the Revolutionary War who had lived in New York. Livingston's descendants had always believed the poem was stolen from their ancestor and asked Foster to investigate the literary mystery. Though Foster could find no physical evidence, such as an original manuscript, to prove Livingston's authorship, he was able to make a very convincing case against Moore. Right, jolly old elf. Originally titled An Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas, the poem was first published anonymously in 1823 in a newspaper in Troy, New York. For 2 decades, the poem was reprinted throughout the country and it became hugely popular. The poem changed the way Americans thought about St. Nicholas and helped form the modern American concept of Santa Claus. Before the 1820s, people had imagined St. Nicholas as a dour, skinny bishop who visited children to dispense discipline as well as gifts. The poem transformed him into the right jolly old elf we know today. It also introduced the idea of the flying reindeer and sleigh and Santa's entry by way of the chimney. The stern, rigid Moore was incapable of dreaming up such a lovely fantasy, claims Foster, who compares Moore to Dr. Seuss's Grinch. Moore's poems depict children as loud, poorly behaved annoyances in need of discipline, not as darlings with visions of sugar plums dancing in their heads. The Night Before Christmas is as different from Moore's other children's verse as Christmas cookies from steamed spinach, Foster writes. Da-da-dum, da-da-dum. The verse is written in anapestic tetrameter, which emphasizes the beat on every third syllable. Da-da-dum, da-da-dum. Moore never used that style in his poems, but Livingston wrote many such anapests, and his poems just sound right. Here's a snippet. But hark what a clatter, the jolly bells ringing, the lads and the lasses so jovially singing. Livingston's poems were full of whimsy, flying children, animals, fairies, boats, and other things. He also fancied himself an expert on the Arctic and wrote elsewhere about Lapland's reindeer. Speaking of reindeer, now, Dasher, now, Dancer, now, Prancer and Vixen, on, Comet, on, Cupid, on, Dunder and Blixem. Dunder and Blixem? Yes, those spellings and that unusual punctuation are in the original version of the poem. Foster says that Moore, who spoke German but not Dutch, misstated the original names of St. Nick's last 2 reindeer. He wrote them as the German Donner and Blitzen instead of the original Dutch Dunder and Blixem, meaning thunder and lightning. Foster's challenge of Moore's authorship of the Christmas classic will cause debate among literary scholars. Meanwhile, the rest of us can just hang our stockings by the chimney with care and be glad the jolly old poem lives on. Now we're going to go back through the article and we're going to read it a little more closely. Dunder and Blixem, Who Really Wrote the Night Before Christmas by Debbie Nevins. "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse." The word "'twas" is underlined. The definition of "'twas" simply is a contraction for "it was." So begins one of the most beloved poems in the world. Again, you have a word that's underlined, beloved, and that's an adjective, which just means that it's something that's loved by many people. Countless families read it aloud on Christmas Eve. I've read it aloud before. Many people can recite it by heart. Well, I can't recite it by heart, I don't think, but I have read it before. Indeed, the poem, commonly called The Night Before Christmas, has a special place in the hearts of millions across the country, and everyone knows that a jolly old gentleman named Clement Clark Moore wrote the verse. So this guy, Clement Clark Moore, is supposedly the author of the original poem. Except 'twasn't, says Don Foster. So Don Foster is another name. Now, it's easy to get the names confused when you're reading a nonfiction article that has different people that it talks about. So let's make sure we understand. The author is Clement Clark Moore. The other person, Don Foster, is a well-known literary detective. So, a literary detective. Let's think about that for just a minute. So, literary sounds kind of like the word literature, and it pretty much means something having to do with writing or the written text. And a detective obviously is someone who solves mysteries. So a literary detective would seem to be, to me, someone who solves mysteries having to do with something that's written. And this is what Don Foster does. Legend has it that Moore wrote the poem for his family while headed home in a sleigh after buying the Christmas turkey. In his book, Author Unknown, On the Trail of Anonymous, Foster says that Moore, a wealthy biblical scholar and poet, falsely claimed credit for the poem in 1844. So, Foster, who was the literary detective, actually has a book called Author Unknown, On the Trail of Anonymous. So I'm going to put that in green. So Foster, who is the author and the literary detective, is now accusing Moore of lying. And I'm going to go back to a previous story we read and use a little dialect. Foster says, "You a lie." Foster analyzes writings of anonymous or questionable authorship, such as poems, books, and ransom notes. Ooh, ransom notes. Interesting. So he solves the mystery of who wrote the ransom note in order to identify the author. Okay. No two individuals write exactly the same way, using words in the same combinations or with the same patterns of spelling and punctuation, Foster says. So we're still talking about Foster, and this is something Foster said, so I'm going to put it in the same green highlighting. Indeed, writing style is as unique as fingerprints or DNA, he argues. Wow, that's pretty interesting. I really didn't know that your writing style was as unique as your DNA. Writing style, fingerprints, DNA. The real author, Foster claims, is a little-known Dutch-American poet named Major Henry Livingston, Jr. Now, here's another name that we have to keep up with. So I'm going to give this one another color. We're going to use blue highlighting for Major Henry Livingston, Jr., an officer in the Revolutionary War who had lived in New York. Livingston's descendants had always believed the poem was stolen from their ancestor and asked Foster, he's the literary detective, to investigate the literary mystery. Descendants is a word that you'll notice is underlined. A descendant is a family member who comes after the person. For example, if you're talking about yourself, you are the descendant of your parents and grandparents. And one day when you grow up and have children of your own, they will be your descendants. Though Foster could find no physical evidence, such as an original manuscript, to prove Livingston's authorship, he was able to make a very convincing case against Moore. In this one paragraph, we have a mention of all three of those names that we were trying to keep straight. So Foster, who is the literary detective, and we also have Livingston, who is the guy whose descendants claim that he is the real author. And we have Moore. Moore is the person who actually claims to be the author. We also have a word that's underlined here, manuscript. A manuscript is the original piece of work, of a written work. Right Jolly Old Elf. Originally titled An Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas, the poem was first published anonymously in 1823 in a newspaper in Troy, New York. For 2 decades is 20 years. For 2 decades, the poem was reprinted throughout the country, and it became hugely popular. I'd say because it's really popular now. Let me change the color of this to show that these are margin notes and not pre-reading notes. Whoops. The poem changed the way Americans thought about St. Nicholas and helped form the modern concept of Santa Claus. Before the 1820s, people had imagined St. Nicholas as a dour, skinny bishop who visited children to dispense discipline as well as gifts. Dour means stern, strict, or gloomy, like frowny face guy. And the word dispense means to distribute or to give out. So, apparently, before the poem was written, St. Nicholas, who we now call Santa Claus, was a grumpy old skinny old bishop who gave kids treats and punishment. The poem transformed him into the right jolly old elf we know today. It also introduced the idea of flying reindeer and sleigh and Santa's entry by way of the chimney. So I'm wondering how did he visit? How did he visit the kids before he started coming down the chimney? That's my question, which should start with a capital. The stern, rigid Moore was incapable of dreaming up such a lovely fantasy, claims Foster. There's Foster again. And Moore. Who compares Moore to Dr. Seuss's Grinch. So basically he's saying that this guy Moore, Clement Clark Moore, he was a grumpy meanie. Okay. Moore's poems depict children as loud, poorly behaved annoyances in need of discipline, not as darlings with visions of sugar plums dancing in their heads. The Night Before Christmas is as different from Moore's other children's verse as Christmas cookies from steamed spinach, Foster writes. So an annoyance is something that annoys people or annoys you, and a sugar plum is a candy coated in sugar, or it could be plums that are preserved in sugar. And we have again the names Moore and Foster. Okay. So Foster says that part of his proof that Moore did not write the poem was that his view of children was completely opposite of what the poem is showing. He says that Moore thought that kids were annoyances and they needed discipline and they weren't good little boys and girls. Instead of how the poem shows them as little darlings, sweet little children with visions of sugar plums dancing in their head. So, because he says that Moore's other poems are so different from this one that there's no way he could have possibly written this, and he compares the other poems that he writes. He makes an analogy. He says that Moore's other children's verse are as different from this poem as cookies are from steamed spinach. So this poem was not even similar at all to any of Clement Clark Moore's other poetry. I keep doing that. Okay. Da-da-dum, da-da-dum. The verse is written in anapestic tetrameter. That's a big fancy word that means a poetic meter that has 4 feet per line. Each foot has 2 unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable. Basically, all that means is that it has a rhythm, and the beat is on the third sound. Da-da-dum, da-da-dum. Which emphasizes the beat on every third syllable. Da-da-dum, da-da-dum. Moore never used that style in his poem. Here again is another piece of evidence that supports the theory that Moore did not really write this poem. But Livingston, remember Livingston is the guy whose descendants are claiming he wrote the poem. Livingston wrote many such anapests, and an anapest is a poem or a piece of a poem that has that beat or that rhythm. And his poems just sound right. Here's a snippet. Now I'm going to highlight this whole thing in blue because this is a snippet from another one of Livingston's anapests. But hark what a clatter, the jolly bells ringing, the lads and the lasses so jovially singing. Jovially means happy. Happily. Livingston's poems were full of whimsy, flying children, animals, fairies, boats, and other things. Whimsy is simply playful behavior or something humorous, not being serious. Something that's whimsical is something that's playful and fantastical. He also fancied himself an expert on the Arctic and wrote elsewhere about Lapland's reindeer. So that would give evidence that there would be a reason for him to have reindeer in the poem, whereas Moore apparently had no such experience, and there would be no logical reason for Clement Clarke Moore to add reindeer to the poem. So let me go ahead and put this one in blue. Um, uh, and I'm going to highlight this little tidbit of information in blue as well. Okay. Speaking of reindeer, well, let me back up. Okay, so there's evidence that Livingston would logically add some reindeer to the poem. Okay, speaking of reindeer, now, Dasher, now, Dancer, now, Prancer and Vixen, on, Comet, on, Cupid, on, Dunder and Blixem. Now, notice that the exclamation marks are in a different place from where you'd expect them to be. Usually when we read the poem itself, we say, now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donner and Blitzen. But in this original version, it says now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donner and Blixen, Dunder and Blixen. Dunder and Blixem? Yes, those spellings and that unusual punctuation are in the original version of the poem. Foster says that Moore, who spoke German but not Dutch, misstated the original names of St. Nick's last two reindeer. So, Foster, who is, as we now know very well, the literary detective, says that when Moore translated the poem and tried to claim it, that he did it wrong. And, whoops, did him the wrong color. And that he put the German translation of the two names instead of the Dutch. And apparently the original poem was in Dutch. And so the names were changed to Donner and Blitzen. He wrote them as the German Donner and Blitzen instead of the original Dutch Dunder and Blixem, meaning thunder and lightning. So that makes me wonder, what did the names of all the other reindeer mean? So I'm thinking if Dunder and Blixem in the original poem had meanings, wonder what the meanings of all the other reindeer names, Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, and Cupid. Wonder what the meanings of their names were. Foster's challenge of Moore's authorship of the Christmas classic will cause debate among literary scholars. Meanwhile, the rest of us can just hang our stockings by the chimney with care and be glad that the jolly old poem lives on. So Foster has challenged Moore's authorship, and basically what that means is that Foster has just made a statement that there's no way this guy wrote this poem. But really he doesn't have enough physical evidence to prove it. So it's just a challenge. And it's likely to continue to cause debate among literary scholars or people who study. A scholar is a person who studies the text or writings. So that's what a literary scholar is. So in this paragraph they're saying that this is likely to continue to be a debate. And the rest of us who really don't care at this point who wrote the poem are just happy that the poem is still around. You can get your own copy of this Google Doc by clicking on the link on the haiku page where you found this video. Be sure to make a copy of the document when you open it so it will appear on your Google Drive and you can add your own notes in the margins. You will also find this document helpful when you take the quiz, which is also on the haiku page.